Just a second. Please, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, we can.
All right, thank you. I still can't hear you all, so I guess I'll still go ahead. So hello everyone. I hope you're doing well. It's good to be with you all. I cannot hear you, but I hope that we'll still be able to have a good time together. So today we would like to continue the series that Clcd has been organizing, and for the past number of months, there's been focus on qualitative research and how to ultimately design, collect qualitative data. There's also been presentations on literature review for both qualitative and quantitative research, and then also developing surveys or developing questionnaires for quantitative research. So today we want to talk about effective strategies to collecting data, but I am setting it up in such a way that we talk first about how to actually go about it, how to go about quantitative research in comparison to qualitative research, especially since many of you have, should I say, more exposure or a stronger background to qualitative based on the research series. All right, so I hope by the time we finish this presentation, you would be able to have clear ideas on the differences between quantitative and qualitative research, and you would be able to deduce what the pros and cons are. I'm not going to talk much about pros and cons, but hopefully through the discussion, you would be able to deduce that for yourselves, and then also describe or be able to identify strategies that can help you design and collect quality quantitative information. So when we talk about qualitative research and quantitative research, what exactly are we talking about, right? For what we already know, qualitative research has to do a lot with, for some reason, my screen is acting up. Just a second, let me put it here. All right. When we talk about qualitative research, we're talking about information that we are able to collect, receive from people that we ask questions. But oftentimes these responses that we receive are in the form of words, sentences, symbols, pictures, statements that individuals give us, right? Whereas when you think about quantitative research, broadly, we also try to source information, collect information from individuals or who we typically call our participants or informants. We're able to collect information from them, but we receive that information, even though oftentimes we use words to ask those questions, and sometimes symbols and pictures to ask those questions. Their responses are coded in numbers. All right, we set the responses in such a way that we do get back numbers. All right, and the interesting thing about it is that, well, like I'll say very soon, I think both have their place and it's very important. Now, let's look at some of the differences between these two fields of research, if you want to think about it that way, or fields of asking certain types of questions and also collecting certain types of information. So generally, if you think about qualitative research, the ultimate goal or the main goal, the broad goal, is to understand whatever question you're asking, primarily from the participant's own perspective. So they get to say it how they want to say it. They get to say it how they want to say it. And they get to, and we get to use their words. Whereas when you think of quantitative research, we seek to understand behavior, but oftentimes guided by a set of questions we have asked them and a set of responses they've got to choose from. When you think about the types of questions that individuals who do qualitative research focus on, they are typically the why questions. And if you think of the if you're focusing on why questions, you're indirectly also seeking a lot more information than just the first information the researcher is asking, right? The descriptive questions: what, why is this going on? Why has this happened? What are your perspectives on this issue? What are your opinions on this issue? Whereas when you think of quantitative research, we are more so interested in how much of it, how many times. So quantity, again, you're looking at quantity or focusing on quantity of the information, or typically we say data, right? And how often. You're trying to figure out time, patterns, ultimately looking at patterns in those situations. And of course, as a result of the types of questions we are asking in qualitative research, the responses are very dynamic. They are not set, they are not rigid responses. They are very dynamic in the ways that the respondents speak. It's a free for all, free flow forms of responses. And that's also because naturally our questions are open-ended. We allow our participants to go in whichever direction they understand the question, and we also get to prod a little bit more to go more in depth, right? For quantitative research types of questions, again, based on the way they are set up, they are relatively close-ended questions where you as a participant has to choose one, sometimes more, of the set responses you've been provided. All right, so these are just examples of qualitative research questions as compared to quantitative research questions. So in a qualitative style, you may be asking participants to share some of their concerns about raising a child with Down syndrome, right? And so you're allowing the individual to go in whichever direction they want to go. But in terms of a quantitative research, looking at something similar, you might be given a question where you are asked to rate how you feel about raising a child, and then they give you sample feelings or a set of feelings that you should choose from, right? So it makes your response very rigid. An individual may probably feel all of the four responses there, but depending on how the question was set, they might ask you to choose one, right? So these are differences between these two fields. Another set of differences is in, obviously I've said this already, the format in which the responses comes. It comes in words, feelings, expressions of the participants when you're looking at qualitative research. And then for quantitative research, ultimately it's coded in numerals, all right? And then also the data or the responses you get from your participants are summarized pretty much close to what the participants said when you're looking at qualitative research. So we use their responses, we summarize their responses, sometimes give broad overview of what the various participants said, or the patterns, the views, the themes, as the terms used, and then also give sample verbatim responses of what the participants said. Whilst in quantitative research, we do summarize, all right, but using various statistical analytic tools, all right, and the responses are averages, all right, but again, with numerical backing to be able to see, again, the various patterns that are outlined. So using means, averages, well, means and averages, the same thing. Mode, what are the others? Median, and then also deeper analytic tools, which we'll talk a little bit about. All these are used to help us understand or summarize and understand what the responses of your participants were. All right. Another cool thing about qualitative research is that you're able to adjust your questions as you go, right? Based on you have a set of questions, just like quantitative research folks do have sets of questions. But then the neat thing about qualitative research is as you are asking these questions and receiving responses, based on the patterns you are observing from the responses, you are able to ask further questions, follow-up questions, because you have you are learning new things that you may not have thought about, and so you therefore have the opportunity to ask further questions. That flexibility is not found oftentimes in quantitative related research questions or scales that give you the responses. They've already been preset, and you're going to be using those questions till you finish collecting the data. So sometimes you realize after you collect the data and you analyze it that, maybe we should have asked these other questions because these responses are not necessarily answering the question, but you do not have that opportunity, right? And then when you think about sample size, okay, so if you think about sample size, typically in comparison, qualitative research uses a smaller sample size compared to quantitative research. All right, quantitative research needs technically needs larger sample sizes to be able to, as it were, fulfill various assumptions when using the various statistical tools, right? So for example, to reduce as much bias as possible, the assumption that the larger the sample size, the relatively more should I say, balanced the various extraneous variables would be, and then also the more generalizable your results, right? Whereas for qualitative research, the ultimate goal usually is not to generalize the responses because you want to go more in depth, right? And so typically the sample used are not representative of the population of interest, but they also provide enough time and opportunity to go in depth to ask the various questions that are needed. So depending on what your research question is, you are going to be needing to use what really works for you. All right. Now, the last piece I want to talk about in terms of looking at the differences between the two and hopefully helping individuals or the audience who may not necessarily notice the differences. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more comparative understanding, is also what it is that what exactly it is that we are analyzing. I've mentioned some of these already, but I kind of put it in this term again because depending on what who's reading, it might make a little bit more sense to individuals. We tend to analyze the words, and so for qualitative research, we begin to pay attention to patterns, themes. What are the broad cluster of themes based on the research question? What are the sub ideas based on the research question? All right, or you cluster or group the various drawings because there are certain patterns you're seeing in some drawings versus others, and then we're able to then interpret or talk about those responses. All right, whereas in quantitative research, these groupings are typically looking at the numerals, and interpreting what those numerals mean. All right. When you think about psychometric properties like how reliable your data is, typically, because of the structured or relatively more rigid responses we provide, we are giving the same set of responses to everybody who participates, right? And therefore, data is usually, or responses are usually seen as relatively more objective and uniform. And so quantitative research responses are typically seen as more reliable than qualitative responses, because qualitative responses are relatively more subjective and a lot more, there's wiggle room, right? So there's a lot more information that comes in, right? And there are various methods that are used in collecting the various kinds of responses based on the various kinds of research you're doing. For focus groups focusing on 2 or more people, right, versus the one-on-one interviews or naturalistic observations. You can use archival data. Again, the data is there already. For example, historical information, so you can look at the patterns within them. And then for quantitative research, regardless of however the format in which you send out the information, the questions tend to be close-ended with set of uniform or standardized responses provided for individuals to participate in. Okay, now in doing research, and obviously if you want to ensure quality research, quality data collection, you want to be guided by the various methods or standards or processes that govern what you're doing. We do have what we'd call the scientific method when you look at it for the qualitative research. I did not include that because based on the previous presentations done, conversations and discussions have been done on that. But when you focus on the quantitative research process, there seems to be a standardized, uniform, step-by-step process, right? You cannot do step 3 before doing step 1. You cannot do step 3 before doing step 2. However, in qualitative research, there is that wiggle room for that to happen, where sometimes we actually form our hypothesis after we collect the data and we are looking at the themes. But in quantitative research, that is not so. We need to follow a standardized format. You need to know what your research question is, gather information about your research question. We talked about literature review already in previous presentations. The goal of the literature review is to understand what exists already regarding your research question. The beautiful thing about that is it helps you understand, one, the theoretical principles that guide your work, and that's very important also in quantitative research. And then also helps you examine whether your research question has already been tested maybe multiple times or not, or maybe it has been tested but not in a certain area. So for example, if your research question was originally focused on, say, parents, you may do your literature review and find that there's a lot more research on mothers but not on fathers. And would that then influence how you move forward? Maybe you might be interested in looking at the same research question, but more so with fathers, right? Or the study has been looked at focusing on adolescent females or males. What about females, all right? Or it's been looked at with typically developing children of a certain age, right? And in a certain community, in a certain region, or with IQ levels of a certain range, but not of the other range, right? So that's a cool thing about literature review, being able to read to see what exists, because that gives you a lot more information. And then also what gap exactly you want to fill, right? It also helps you figure out the various methods used or the kinds of questions that were asked. So that can guide you and enrich your own development or decision making on which skills, which measures to use for your research question. Okay, and then also based on that, you are able to formalize of your hypothesis, ensuring that your variables are very clear. In qualitative research, sometimes we don't even know what's out there, right? So we are asking broad research questions, sometimes relatively more specific, and then based on the feedback or based on the responses of our participants, we're able to learn exactly what it is we are looking for, exactly what it is that we are curious about. But in quantitative research, it is important to clearly define, and this is where we talk about operational definitions, clearly define the measure or the variable of interest. Are you looking at what, for example, we hear a lot about psychological well-being, right? What exactly is psychological well-being? Because that's a broad statement. Are we talking specifically about depression? Are we specifically talking about anxiety? Are we specifically talking about stress? What is it that we are talking about, right? If your goal was to look at stress, then maybe you should focus on stress and not psychological well-being, right? So stress might be also your operational definition. Stressful experiences might be your operational definition for psychological well-being. When, for example, you are looking at, let's say, exams and maybe family dynamics or childcare and its impact on academic performance. Maybe it is you are trying to look at the stressful experiences that parents go through, parents go through, not necessarily the depressive experiences they go through, right? So then stressful experiences would be the operational definition of psychological well-being if you choose to use that as your broad research construct. So forming your hypothesis is so important, and operationally defining your variables. That is going to be a must if you want quality data. All right, and I'll say that again somewhere else. All right, then how you design your step 4, how you design your study is also going to be important, and it is based on your hypothesis, what it is you are looking for, what the measures are, and broadly what question you are asking. All right, you need to design, and then based on your design, so what I mean by that is, are you interested in descriptive information? Is that what you're looking for? Or are you looking at relationships? I'll talk about that briefly again. So when I get there, we'll talk a little bit more about design. All right. And then based on your design, you can then figure out the method, how you should collect the data, or what measures you should use to collect the data. Obviously, once you collect the data, you can analyze the data based on your hypothesis. Right, you are always, everything you do is based on your hypothesis. So you collect the data and analyze the data to answer your hypothesis. All right. Okay. So before can I jump into some of these pieces in quantitative research, sometimes people ask, which is better, qualitative research or quantitative research? I would like to hear your responses in the chat, if possible. Both are valuable, and I think for many of you doing research, you know that neither of them is better than the other. They are both valuable, and they also answer different kinds of questions, right? But ultimately, they give us deeper understanding of various phenomenon, behaviors, constructs. They even give us deeper understanding of policies, ideas, whatever it is that your question is about. Depending on what your question is, one or the other can answer it well enough to gather your overall finding. All right, so your question determines which direction you're going to go. All right, and whilst I say neither is the better, we cannot also deny that both, I always say both play a huge role in our understanding of the phenomenon of interest that we have. right? And there are times where both are actually used in research, which in many ways is way more robust, if you ask me. It's way more robust when both are used, and we call those kinds of research mixed methods research, all right? And in mixed method research, there are various designs that show up with it, where, for example, you might do that's the broad sequential design kinds of mixed methods research, where the primary focus is on qualitative. You work on qualitative research first, and based on the information you get, you use that to develop measures so you can understand a little bit more of the how much, the how many, how often do these occurrences happen, okay? And then you can interpret your results. You can also go the other way around if you are trying to look at the quantitative research first. So you find out that these patterns, there's a significant difference between experiences, perceptions of group A to group B. So then you go to the next step of, okay, you want to know a little bit more about these perceptions within the two groups. So you develop questions that you use to get more in-depth responses to the findings you had when you use the quantitative research, right? Then there are also individuals who like to do concurrent designs, where your main research question and study is focused on quantitative. You're using a quantitative, you're seeking quantitative data, you're using quantitative research, and then in that, you have a few measures or scales that ask qualitative questions. Or the other way around, the main focus is qualitative, and then you have a few questions that ask quantitative questions, wow. Right? So for example, let's say you're interested in understanding experiences of parents. I did this research, it's relatively more present in my mind right now. You're interested in looking at parents' experiences of raising children with, say, I just use the example, Down syndrome, right? You want to understand parents' daily experiences, right? So that's what and so you seek to ask questions to understand their in-depth experiences. And then along the way, you want to understand certain patterns, or want to see how often this experience happens. So you may put in a measure. You might ask them whilst they're doing, either they respond themselves, or you ask them and then you put the responses there. Maybe you want to understand their stressful patterns every day, or anxiety experiences whenever there is a crisis of some sort. All right, so you can use the quantitative measure to ask that question. So these are the various kinds of mixed methods designs out there. I would not be surprised that there are even others that people use, which ultimately the goal is to get robust data, right? Okay, so let's now segue into talking a little bit about the various quantitative research designs out there, and then we can we can then tie it up together and talk about some tips to ensure quality data, all right, or quality data collection. There are about 4 to 6 types of quantitative research designs out there. You can break it up into however clusters you want. People even collapse into 3. Excuse me. And so the first one I want to talk about is broadly what we call descriptive research. And descriptive research focuses on broadly looking at patterns. For example, if you do not know much about an area, the quantitative research might be the first step to learn more about ways in which participants describe the phenomenon of interest. So for example, let's say you want to know how maybe HR employees, people who work in HR, or recruiters, what their views are on the types of, like, dress code in terms of hiring or coming for a job interview. what are their perspectives on the kinds of dress code. All right. And so you might give them a list and say something, for example, as rate your preference on the following dress styles for job interviews. And you might give them, you could either give them a picture or you can describe in written form what the various dress codes are. And then you ask them to score them from, say, 1 being lowest preference or lowest, the least preferred, to 5, the most preferred for the job interview. These participants are going to then respond based on your set of uniform, rigid responses. They've got to pick 1 to 5 for each of the dress code you give them, right? And then based on that, you can then analyze the data to understand how these recruiters or HR personnel view the various kinds of dress code used, right? Now, one of the interesting things about descriptive research is that if you really think about it, it overlaps with what qualitative research is about, right? Where individuals describe their preferences and opinions. However, the difference is that for quantitative descriptive research protocol, you have close-ended questions with set responses. If it was a qualitative study, you'd allow the participants to tell you a little bit more about why they prefer the various kinds of dress codes, right? Okay. Then we have correlational research, and the goal of correlational research is not as much to describe the experiences, but to examine if there are statistical relationships. Are there any relationships between the ideas or the variables or the behaviors that you want to study? All right, so the focus is way more on the relationship. So you hear things like correlation, linkage, relationship. All right, and sometimes people call correlational research descriptive research. So you might see the two being collapsed together. Right. But if you really think about it, it's just, so I guess in that sense, they are thinking about it as that you are describing the relationship between the variables, right? But technically, the goal is to look at relationships. In correlational research, in looking at the relationships, you are seeking to know if there is, for example, a positive relationship between the two variables, or a negative relationship between the two variables. And when we talk about positive relationships, we are pretty much thinking about, as, for example, as X increases, Y is increasing as well, right? The more you eat, or the more junk food you eat, the more weight you put on, right? That's a positive relationship between junk food and weight gain, right? The more food you eat, let me put it this way: the more exercise that you have, right? As you exercise more, you technically lose weight. Yes, there's some people who do a lot of exercise and do not lose the weight, or they lose and then they plateau at a point. I get that, but I'm just trying to figure out give examples of relationship. So the more exercise you put in, you might probably also say the less junk food you eat, you are also more likely to lose the weight. So more exercise, less lower weight gain, or there's reduction in weight. That would be a negative relationship. So in correlational research, you tend to look for that, and the responses are denoted by plus or negative to give you an idea of what the relationship is. Then you also typically see numerals. For example, 0.89 or -63. What typically the value 6389 tends to represent the strength of the relationship, and the strength of the relationship usually falls between 0 and 1, but more specifically -1 through 0 to +1, because you're looking at the direction of the relationship, right? So whether it's positive or negative, and then the strength being from 0 to 1 in either direction. So 0 then means no relationship. And then from 0, as you edge towards 1, the stronger the relationship, right? So obviously 0.89 will be stronger than 0.43. Now, negative 0.89 will also be stronger than negative 0.43 when you're talking about correlational research, because remember, the negative and positive sign denotes the direction, right? And then the magnitude denotes the strength of the relationship. So negative 0.89 means there's a stronger negative correlation between the two variables, let's say eating junk food and weight gain, versus negative 0.43. All right, that's a relatively weaker negative relationship. Okay, now the third design is what we'll call like quasi-experimental research, right? And for quasi-experimental research, and the fourth one being experimental research. Now note, all of these, your responses are oftentimes deduced or gathered in numerals, okay? As compared to qualitative research, where it's way more words, descriptors, symbols, and all of that. Okay, so for quasi-experimental research, as compared to experimental research, you are looking at patterns and relationships, right? However, the variables, the focus usually here is on the variables of interest. You have what we call the independent variables and the dependent variables in both scenarios, right? The independent variable is typically the variable that you are examining its effect on the dependent variable. So, for example, let's say you want to look at the effect of parent engagement on language acquisition. In other words, you are looking to see maybe too much engagement, too little engagement, or the types of engagement and how they impact language acquisition of babies, all right? Whether it's delayed or it's at a natural or expected pace. All right, so your dependent variable is language acquisition. Your independent variable is parent engagement, right? Now, the interesting thing about quasi-experimental research versus experimental research is how the independent variable it's seen, and then also certain various other expectations seen in experimental research that you may not necessarily see in quasi-experimental research. So let me talk about the IVs first. So in terms of the independent variables, typically in experimental research, you can manipulate the variable. So for example, in parent engagement, if you are doing a specific experiment, maybe you have been able to operationally define, for example, parent engagement as, let's say, the number of hours spent with a child, right? And then you are interested in looking to see if 2 hours or less versus 3 hours and more, if there is a significant difference in levels of engagement and language acquisition, maybe over a period of time, or maybe over, let's say, during month 2 of the child. All right, here you are manipulating your IV, which is the number of hours, right? The parent spends. You're looking at those people. You're probably going to be looking at people who spend that much time versus 3 or more, right? But in terms of quasi-experimental research, the IVs are typically naturally occurring and oftentimes linked to the participant in a way that you cannot manipulate that. So for example, let's say you want to look at the ethnicity of parents and their engagement with their children, which is associated with language acquisition. you cannot manipulate ethnicity. You can't say, okay, you are going to be you are going to be grouped as Ewes or French, and then you guys are going to be grouped as Akans or Australians. You can't do that, right? Same thing with other variables like sex, gender, you name it, the various other kinds as well, right? You cannot change that variable for the individual, but you can manipulate the number of hours, as in sometimes telling people, for example, to stay in a certain place for a number of hours compared to the others. Certain variables that we look at are naturally occurring, and we cannot change them. And so in such a situation, a quasi-experimental research is going to be used. All right, as opposed to a true experiment where you can manipulate the independent variable, right? Now, another piece about that is for experimental research, based on ultimately your long-term goal, which is to look at patterns or causal patterns. You cannot necessarily look at causal patterns in quasi-experimental research, in part because you cannot do these manipulations that you can readily and easily do in experimental research. Right. So for quasi-experimental research, you tend to be looking at, I won't say fake experiment, but maybe we would say not as rigid or robust an experimental design as you do for a true experiment. Another interesting piece about experimental research, what people call true experiments, is that in terms of your participants, you are able to select your participants in such a way that, again, you control a lot about your groups that you are seeking to do research with. But and generally what I mean there is that you can randomly select your participants, and oftentimes randomly assign participants to the various conditions or IVs that you are interested in. But for quasi-experimental research, you're not able to necessarily do that, right? So again, you can, like I said before, with regards to the naturally occurring participant variables, you cannot randomly select and say, okay, these individuals, you are going to be, well, you cannot randomly assign and say, these individuals, you're going to be male and you're going to be female, or you're going to be tall and you're going to be short. That is not possible. At the same time, also, there are times where it will be hard to randomly select your participants. When you're doing research, for example, looking at, if your research question is focused on, for example, the effects of retirement on sexual activity, right? You have to, in terms of your participants, your focus is often going to be on individuals who are retired. You cannot use children, right? You cannot use individuals who are, for example, at work, unless your research question is going to be a comparison question, where you are going to be comparing retired versus non-retired individuals. So these are all interesting pieces related to quasi-experimental research that you may not necessarily be able to do with experimental. You may not be able to. These are some of the patterns that we need to pay attention to when looking at quasi-experimental research versus true experiments. Okay. Now, there are various types of methodology or designs actually that are used for quasi-experimental research. There are the pre-test, post-test designs, right? There are the time-related designs like time series. There are the developmental related designs like cross-sectional research, where that you're focusing on collecting data on a group of individuals here, and then you analyze their data, versus looking at a group of individuals over time, same group of individuals over time. And sequential designs actually use both, all right? So looking at cross-sectional patterns, but at the same time, also looking at the longitudinal pieces as well. So these are all important designs to pay attention to. And based on your research question and your hypothesis, you'll be able to distinguish which research design, which quantitative research design to use to be able to collect your data, to be able to collect your data and then to be able to analyze it for ultimately and hopefully quality responses or quality answer to your original research question. So what are some of the tips that is helpful when broadly doing quantitative research? The first thing I probably want to ask you is the top, and I'm sorry, I can't hear, I'm not able to hear you all. So if you could put in the chat, that would be fantastic. What do you call this thing? This picture in front of you here, what do you call this? Could you please put responses in the chat for me? And then the same for the second picture as well. This car here, what did you call this part of the car? Chat, please. I'd like to see your responses. All right, someone says cabinet. Okay, what else? Boot, yeah? What else? Okay, car boot, okay? Wonderful. Now, for some people, thank you for the response. For some people, it is going to be important for us to note that not everybody is familiar with the word boot. If you come to this, for example, in the US, they're going to call it a trunk, the trunk of the car, right? So when you are doing, when you are planning research, quantitative research, and also asking various kinds of questions, besides having clear, measurable hypotheses, which I've already talked about, it's so important because everything you do is based on that, right? At the end of the day, your interpretation is going to be based on your hypothesis. So it definitely the variables of interest must be clear, right? And also linked to that, you want to be sure that your participants understand what it is you are going to be saying. You want to be very, you want to help them with that. So in some parts of the world, it's called the trunk of a car. In other parts of the world, it's called a boot. So if you are going to be asking questions and you are using trunk in a place where they understand boot, you're likely to get wrong responses, excuse me, or inaccurate responses. Right? In some places, they call this picture here cabinet. In some other places, they may call it a cupboard, right? So again, you must be careful to make sure that you know your population, understand they understand the variables that they or should I say use variables they understand, so that you are able to get more accurate responses. All right, and that also links to, I probably have one more picture on that I wanted to talk about. I probably talk about it somewhere else. That point 2 also links to the third point in another format. If you are working with people from different groups, you want to be sure that different cultures, you want to be sure that the process of your research is the same for both groups. All right, because your ultimate goal is to reduce as much bias, as much extraneous variables that can influence how your participants respond. Remember, you are giving only structured responses. If it was qualitative research, you might be able to deduce differences in responses based on an issue. So for example, let's say it rained and there was a flood, right? Before you started collecting data before the flood, and then after the flood, you continued. For qualitative researcher, you might be able to learn that before the flood, they might have answered in a certain way based on your research question. But after the flood, the flood impacted them, so responded in another way, right? You are not able to, we don't have that luxury always with quantitative research. So as much as possible, you want to be mindful when collecting data to make sure that everything, you're right from the design all the way to data collection, there is equivalence, there's uniformity in what you're doing, all right? So pay attention to language, pay attention even to dialect, right? So if the dialect, let's say you're collecting data in, let's say among the Akan people, broadly, you want to pay attention to what you're asking, how you're asking it, when you're talking to Fantis versus when you're talking to the Chims, because the responses would vary based on what they hear. And this is true with other languages as well. All right, the construct, you want to be mindful to be sure that it means the same thing. It means the same thing in every group you're working with. All right, if in a group it means something very different, you will get very different responses, all right? And that would impact your data analysis and interpretation of it, all right? You also want to be mindful of, you have to ask yourself who exactly needs to be answering your research question, all right? Of course, that is dependent heavily on your research question, your hypothesis, what your hypothesis is about, right? It's going to guide who it is that should be responding to the survey. If your research question is focused on parents and maybe their relationship with their spouse, yes, we may have access to, for example, college students, right? And so we might want to use college students for it, but we need to be very careful and make sure that the question we are asking is actually for them, right? So sampling college students does not necessarily mean that you're going to get the answers that you are asking relating to the relationship, like couplehood. Right? So you have to be very mindful what you're asking. And sometimes you would have to you would have to add questions in your survey that helps you distinguish who the participants are. Right? So for example, I was doing research on, say, premarital counseling, and you want to ask questions. And if your participant group is, let's say, a sample of college students, we know there are quite a number of college students who are probably married, single, in a relationship, divorced, all right? And so if we're going to give this question to college students, we probably have to ask questions that help us know who these participants are, all right? And then also make sure that the questions are such that they can answer it. So if your questions are for individuals who are actively, let's say, they're about to get married, so they are doing premarital counseling, right? Those who are single cannot answer those questions. So you want to make sure that you ask questions and skip patterns, if you have to use skip patterns, to make sure that it's the people who need to be answering the questions who actually answer the question. If there are individuals who are divorced, they may not be able to answer the same questions. They may not be able to answer the set of questions you have. You may want to give them similar questions, but the instructions would have to be different, right? So you need to pay attention to these nuances to ensure that you gather or you collect quality information, all right? Also, skip that for now for the sake of time. Okay. You also want to be mindful of how you want to collect your data. Are you going to collect your data online? Are you going to collect your data in person? Right? Are you going to mail the survey or your questionnaire to the participants? All of these things will depend on research question, your participants, and also their location. So if you live in a society where the mail system works and you can mail it, why not? You could use online if you want to, but you also have to pay attention to your participants. If your participants are college students, I guess that's a relatively easy way to go. But if your participants are elderly, And I'm not saying that older people don't know how to use internet or online stuff, but we still have to be mindful to ask ourselves, are they going to be able to answer these questions online? Or would it be better if we sent like a paper version, or we are there in person to collect that data with them present? We need to ask these questions and not just use online because it's easier. As an example, I'm using online as an example, or in person because you can easily find the people and just walk to them. You need to be mindful of these questions. You need to figure out what would be the best modality, what the advantages are in using it, and what the disadvantages are also in using it. All right. You also want to be mindful about where you recruit from. Where are you going to recruit from? Are you going to walk or go to the location? For example, going to the bank, the bank, because your research question is focused on the tellers. Would that be the wise way to do it? Or would you just send it through social media? Or would you decide that you're not going to use any of that? You would find a market research platform and then post your questions there, include your inclusion criteria, and then collect the data that way. You want to find that out because that is also going to influence the quality of your responses. All right. Now another piece I want to add to where you recruit and the modality you use is with regards to online surveys. Online surveys, we know, has been really helpful to all of us who do quantitative research. But we really have to ask ourselves who exactly is taking the survey when we put it out online. All right. So when you put a survey out, let's say you decide to use Facebook or Reddit or any of the online social media portals that are familiar to your environment or to your people group, who exactly is answering those questions? We typically say that participants should be, especially if your research questions for adults, participants should be 18 and above. But on these platforms, are there participants who are below 18? Is it possible that they will take the survey and say they are 18? Now, that also bridges into ethical issues, right? At the same time, it dilutes your responses if you're having individuals who do not qualify, but they have easy access to the service. So that's something you need to figure out and ask yourself how you can ensure that you are collecting quality responses or quality data based also on your research question. Where they are located could also impact your responses. So you need to be mindful of that, right? So for example, I was doing, my student and I were doing research looking at mental health stigma across the United States and India, all right? And we're going to collect data from Indians. Our goal was, we were looking for participants from Indians in India, all right? Because we're looking at, it was a cross-cultural study. So we're also looking at certain cultural variables. And so we used one of the market research platforms. And thankfully in the data collection software that we were using, as we're working on it, I found out that I could figure out geolocation of my participants. So I decided to go ahead and use it. It wasn't because I knew beforehand, but I decided to go ahead and click on that so I could get geolocation. I wasn't asking for any identifying information beyond that. So when we collected the data, what we found was that let me talk about the response first and then the prodding. The responses per cultural expectations and analysis seem to be a little different from what was hypothesized and expected. So as we were going through the data and cleaning the data, looking at the geolocation, what we found was that even though the respondents or the participants who used the market research platform said they lived in India, a number of them were taking the survey from the US, and then also from other countries, not India. Right? And then there were those who were in India. The geolocation indicated that they were in India. And so that was very insightful for us, because we realized, well, the question we're asking, even though we understood the various patterns, it was possible that some of our respondents lived in a different culture, and were probably likely to respond to the questions based on the culture in which they lived, not necessarily the culture in which they identified with, all right? So it's important for us to pay attention to these things so that we can ensure quality data that we are collecting, okay? In wrapping up, I wanted to also talk about analysis. We can collect quality data, but then at the end of the day, we seek to analyze and interpret the data, right? So right from the very beginning, we need to be seeking to ensure quality processes all the way to the very end. So we need to also involve people during the analysis and interpretation stage, because typically when you have multiple people working on working on one's research and analysis, it's amazing how much stronger, and maybe should I say purer, the responses end up becoming, because you have multiple views that help center and ensure that it's not only your perception that you're using to interpret the data, because we all interpret information based on our glasses, right? The glasses we wear, right? And so it's important that we have multiple viewpoints to help us center the results. And also it's important to center the results based on the population, the context, the culture in which you collected the data from, and not your own perspectives or your own understanding. That is so important. Where you have the opportunity to also hear the viewpoints of individuals in the environment, context, culture, and that you collected the data from, that would also help to clarify the various patterns, to again ensure that you have quality responses and not just responses based on your viewpoint or your perspective. All right. So over the years, that's been an issue that we see with a lot of research out there, where viewpoints are, where we interpret the data based on viewpoints that often end up becoming inaccurate or incomplete. So as much as possible, we want to do that. And of course, what is high quality data? If we do not also seek to ensure that we accurately interpret the results. All right. So I think I'm going to pause here and then allow for any questions, as I see it's already time and we have to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mam, for the presentation. So I think Dr. Mam can't hear us, so you can type your questions into the chat box and then she will answer them.
I can actually hear you now. Isn't that interesting? So please go ahead and feel free to ask as well. That's fine.
All right, so you can raise your hand up and then you can ask your question. You can also type it into the chat box.
Did you all understand all of that? If you don't have a question for me, then I have one for you. So how about you tell me what you learned? What was clearer for you? What was something new you learned? Or maybe, hopefully, as you share that, you can probably throw in a question as well. So you can either raise up your hand or put in the chat. Yes, Esther.
Thank you, Prof. Please, for me, I wanted to just say what was more clearer to me. The great distinction between quantitative and qualitative research, the fact that there's no right or wrong, not that one is better than the other, but each has a unique area and is addressing a unique problem, and the richness of mixed method and how you can get diverse information from both qualitative and quantitative side put together. So for me, what I just enjoyed how when you were looking at the comparison between the qualitative and the quantitative, the comparison, I just enjoyed the whole thing, looking at how one is going in depth, one is looking at the bigger picture and the figures aspect. So that's just a general, maybe I should say a general observation. And thank you so much. I'll connect more.
Sure, anytime. Thank you. I appreciate that. MFA. Hello, MFA.
Can you hear me, please?
We can now hear you.
Okay. So I'm in my second year doing an MPhil in psychology. My research is around I'm doing a qualitative research, and this is my first time actually doing something research related. And it's like I'm at a deadlock. I don't know which. So it's been difficult putting together even the proposal stage. It was very difficult just getting, myself to flow. I knew what I wanted to achieve, but I had great difficulty, just putting together the words or even getting, data and literature review to put together the proposal. Now, thankfully, I've got that to I'm at the stage where I have to start writing my chapters, right? And it's just difficult just even putting the words together. I don't know if you've had a similar experience before. A friend of mine tells me the best thing is to collect the data and then you would know how to flow from there. Have you been at that stage before? What did you do that helped?
So it sounds like this is a more heavy qualitative question. Following, maybe I should have shown you all the steps in doing qualitative research. But yes, I think that depending, you need to be sure that you need to be clear on what your research question is, right? And obviously, I would encourage you to do some literature review on that. I know you're writing your chapters, but do some literature review to even understand what it is you want to work on. If you can understand what it is you want, then people can help you even flesh out more the direction to go. Yes, collecting the data, unlike quantitative research, you need your research question, your hypothesis, before you even work towards designing and collecting data. But for qualitative research, there's wiggle room. There's a little bit more flexibility where, so far as you have your broad research question, hopefully rooted in some levels of theory, but it's not required that you have that before you collect the data. You can go ahead and collect the data, and then based on the data, you can answer your research question. I probably would love to. So you asked another question, what have I done in such situations? For me, I think that reading the literature review has helped me, number one. Number two, if it's an issue of being just tired and out of it, taking a break, not a long-term break, but taking a break where you refresh your mind, your body, soul, mind, and spirit is helpful to get your creative juices coming. Number 3, talking to people about your research question, just to hear perspectives also can help kind of break through into what it is you're working on. I hope these have helped me. So I hope these 3 can are things you can consider examining, and then seeing if that helps you some. I really think you should consider talking to people some more about it, because it
Okay,
seems
thank you so much.
you've had a struggle right from the beginning. So I think that you should do some consultations on it some more, so that you feel confident even into collecting your data.
Right, Doc. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Joyce.
Hello, thank you. I've learned something new in terms of this use of the language and the dialecting. You know, these generational gaps, just within some few years, names of things change like that. Now, when you mention food, they will laugh at you because it's now sneakers. And things changes like that. So that one is a new thing I've learned. You have to be careful as the choice of words we use for asking questions for accurate answers. Now, my question is, I'm writing qualitative research, but in terms of data collection, can a co-researcher help you in data collection? If only maybe your interview guys are the same, is it safe? Is my question. Thank you.
If I understand your question, I'll say yes, because you are co-researchers. So hopefully, right from the beginning, you are working together. Also, for the nature of qualitative research is such that we often need research assistants to help us collect the data. I don't know whether yours is one-on-one interview or focus group. Regardless, it's always good to have assistants to help, because again, we don't like in quantitative research. I always work with my students, even when we are submitting IRB. I want them to be there because 1, it's a learning experience for them. 2, they serve as an extra pair of eyes to see what we are doing, so that if I have made a mistake or a typo I've missed out, they can see it and then we can work on it together. In the same way for qualitative research, and more so for qualitative research, having assistants to help. You have to train them so that it's done the way you expect, so there's uniformity, right? So you have to do your pre-training of your assistants so that there's uniformity in the procedure, and then also the way in which you want them to take notes and all of that, because that's going to be necessary when it's time for you to code and do the next steps in terms of inter-rater reliability and all of those things.
Thank you. Thank you for that one.
You're welcome. AM, your hand was up.
Hello, please, can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Thank you for the lecture. I think I enjoyed the part that I came and met, and it was a very good presentation. But then I missed something. I'm also a second-year student, and my research is on mixed method. So I was advised to do sequential explanatory mixed method. And then my topic is on the impact of quality improvement on students' performance.
Impact
and with the quality improvement on students' performance in the health training institutions. So, and I was advised to do explanatory sequential mixed method, which I'm not so familiar with. So I was looking at how to do the literature review. I don't know whether with that type there's a special literature review I have to do, or I don't know. I would be very happy if you can talk to me about it.
So tell me, so based
and
on
how to go about my question is.
Okay, good. So broadly, when it comes to the sequential designs, typically you are starting with either qualitative research and then you add the quant to it. All right, or you start with quant and then you add the qual to it. So I do not know how you plan to do it, but it is going to be important for you to, yes, do your literature review broadly for your research question, because that's going to be needed, right? So do your literature review for it, and then you probably want to find out if there are studies that have looked at it on a qualitative level and those that have looked at it on the quantitative level. And then based on your approach, whether you're going to start with qualitative before you do quant or qual before you do the other way around, then that can guide how you work on designing your study, and then also writing your chapter 1, right? Introduction, and well, chapter 1 and 2. If chapter 2 is literature review, then that can guide how you do it, because then once you do your literature review, then working towards your methods, you can your hypothesis or purpose of study, you can let us know, the readers know, that this study is interested in using this kind of design, this kind of sequential design, and then you explain what you're going to do. You're going to start with a quantitative and then add on the qualitative, or the other way around. And you would obviously have to justify why you are planning to do that. So you help them understand what the benefit of your quantitative piece would do for the qualitative, or the other way around. I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, please. Thank you. But then I have one more to ask.
Yes, please.
I hope I'm not listed. The quality aspect, please. What's the number? How many participants would you advise for the quality aspect? Like to be interviewed. I'm looking at interview as a listener.
So okay, so again, it depends on your research question, right? And then also because your research question is also going to influence the depth of the level of time and analysis you're going to be doing. It might be good to also look at existing research to understand, in terms of that question, what sample sizes have been used, because you also want to think of saturation. I didn't talk about that because that is heavily qualitative terminology, and previous presenters have talked about it. I think, at least I believe I remembered Dr. Sechi talked about it in his presentation. That's one. But two, I believe there are rules of thumb when it comes to sample size. For example, for focus group, the rule of thumb is 6 to 8 per focus group. And depending on your research question, you may want to do 2 sets or 1 set. Again, and depending on time and the various logistics, right? So that's something you want to pay attention to for focus group. So for a one-on-one interview, I can't say I know the exact number you should use, or if there's a rule of thumb, but I probably will lean towards the rule of thumb for the focus group, which was 6 to 8 per focus group. Some go as fast to, some say 12, right? So you can say it's 8 to 12, work around that. Number 3, it's important for you, if you're planning to publish your research, it's important for you to probably look and see in these various, related to your research question and publications, what was the sample size they used? All right, look at the sample size they used across these various studies that have done something similar to yours. And that can guide you to know minimum, maximum, and average number. I always, maybe because of my quantitative background, I always lean towards more. But again, the nature of qualitative research, you have to spend a lot of time working on analyzing your data. But then you need to think about saturation point as well. So you can keep going till you hit saturation point. And that might also be a more ideal way to go, because you want clear new information. So once you keep hearing the same responses, then you probably have hit your saturation point and you can pause. So that will also be another strategy to use in determining the sample size.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Clement.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, I must say I've been very impressed with the presentation. Unfortunately, this is my first time.
Welcome.
I don't know how come I've been missing all these, and I have to only be part of what happened today. But this is a question I have students asking me all the time. So I just want to get your perspective too. We always talk about do a literature review, a literature review. And so for starters, they want to know, for example, that if I'm going to do a literature review, yeah, you're asking me to probably read journals or whatever in my area. Whilst reading, what should I be looking out for? So that eventually I can really get a trend that will eventually get me to maybe find a gap that I can also probably start working on. So, because sometimes you read, and it's like you are reading and you really do not know where it's leading. And so what would you advise in terms of if I'm doing a literature review and I'm reading a paper or whatever, what should I be looking out for so that gradually I can also get there?
Wonderful. That's a great question. In fact, it requires a whole workshop of its own. I do know that previous presenters have talked about literature review. And so since this is your first time, please feel free to look at the main website and then you see the recording on that, okay? But if Joseph, if this area hasn't been dealt with, I'm happy to help with this with another workshop in the near future so we can work through it and probably even do practice together, okay? But in a brief summary, in terms of literature review, the goal of your literature review is to, one, understand what exists out there related to your research question. All right. So let's say you are interested in looking at parent engagement on, what did I say before? Parent engagement and language acquisition of children, right? What exactly is out there? Now, already for me, what comes to mind is the two words, parent engagement, language acquisition, those key variables. Your goal of your literature review is to find out what studies are out there that have looked at parent engagement and language acquisition, okay? Now, once you look for those articles, I think the first thing probably is to read the abstract to know what the study was about, because that gives you a quick overview of what the study was about. And if you already know how you are going to operationally define your variables, for example, language, when you say parent engagement, are you talking about parents helping children with their homework? Or are you talking about parents playing with their children? Are you talking about parents going to the school, like school engagement? What kind of engagement are you talking about? It's just parent engagement. If you already know what you're interested in, then yes, refine your literature search and use that, or say parent engagement in school or parent engagement in pre-K, right? And look more specifically. But if you have no idea what it is, then it's great for you to then read the abstract and then find out what they did. Because as you look at briefly what the study was about, that in itself may give you ideas on, well, it looks like there's a lot of studies on parents in school, going to school, but there isn't a lot about parents and homework. Excuse me. And therefore, that might help refine your interest to say, well, maybe I want to look more. When I say parent engagement, I actually have been meaning parent engagement with regards to doing homework at home. All right. So that's one thing. So look at the abstract. That helps you have a broad idea. Now, when you find the studies that are linked to your interest, your operationally defined interest, let me put it that way, then you can look for a few things. What exactly was the study about? This is a great way to find the theories that support the areas, because a number of these studies will talk about theory, because you do need to understand the theoretical framework with which you're going to be using to outline or support your research. All right, so the intro, and you normally find that in the intro section. So the intro section gives you that. The intro section gives you usually statistics about the issue or the phenomenon. And the cool thing also is that the intro section, obviously there's in-text citations. So you can now use those in-text citations to learn more about your area or information that was said. You can find the authors that way. So that's another useful thing about literature review. It helps you find more authors. All right. Then you also can find out their hypothesis. What did they work on? How is that similar to yours? You can learn from how they even worded it to work on yours. Methodology is a huge place with literature review. Learning to identify what measures did they use. How different is it from the measures these other authors used? Which measure seems to be used repeatedly? And then which measure is used repeatedly across different groups of people or cultures? It's being used across different groups of people and cultures. Pay attention to the psychometric properties. Are they high? If they are high, then it suggests that this is a measure that you probably can use, because there's evidence that the scale seems to be reliable, valid and reliable across different contexts. Okay, so that's something you could look at for the methodology. And then you can also look to see what analysis did they use based on their hypothesis. What analytic tools did they use, right? So all these can give you information. Now, if you are interested in the area but you don't know gaps, what kind of gaps you want to work on, a nice place to look, besides abstract, which gives you a broad overview to know that you are really looking at parent engagement, not something totally different. Look at the discussion section. The discussion section, it's pretty much the English words, or well, in this case we are talking predominantly in English, so the English words that interpret the results or the math or the numerals that was used. Getting to the end where they talk about implications of the study, you are able to learn a lot about how the benefits, and sometimes you also figure out the gaps. You get gaps from the limitation section. It's a beautiful section to figure out also gaps. Excuse me, because some journals will require limitations and future direction. So it's a beautiful place to figure out what has been done already, what is left to be done, and then you can decide to develop your research from there. So I hope this is a brief summary of the beauty and the value of literature review. It's fantastic. If you can get systematic reviews, that even does your work a little bit more easier, because it's a summary of other studies in the same field and their findings, and then also look at their limitation sections, and then the gaps, that the future research sections as well.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So if there are no more questions, thank you very much, Dr. Ham, for this presentation. I believe we all agree that this was a very comprehensive presentation from the distinction between quantitative and qualitative research, the various quantitative research designs, and then let's say to collect very good data. So we are very grateful for your time.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for joining as well. I've put the link to the previous presentations in the chat box. So you can find all the previous presentations there. They cover the literature review, quantitative research, data collection, data analysis. And so there are a lot of questions that will be answered when you go through all the recordings. But I'll also send an email with a link to everyone as well. And then next month, because it's a monthly lecture series, next month on the 27th, which is the last Friday of the month, we'll be having our next lecture. So I hope to see everyone there as well. So I will do the correspondence to email to everyone. So thank you very much for joining our lecture this month. See you all next month. Bye.
And thank you all for an excellent presentation.
Bye, you're welcome.